So what do students of landscape architecture do? What do they learn and what do they produce? Hi, my name is Dr. Irvin Lin. I am the Associate Program Director for the BLA program here at NUS. And I'll show you through the next couple of slides 4 aspects of landscape architecture that we roughly categorize our students' work into. And hopefully you have a better understanding of what the profession is about, how we teach it in NUS, as well as gives you a little bit more on the insights into our profession if you are unfamiliar with landscape architecture. Now, we've split it into 4 very rough themes, in this case community engagement. So one of the things that we will inculcate in you is that you do not design for just nobody. You design for people to use the space, and as such you have to kind of understand the people you're designing for, and that's where community engagement comes in. Detailing and implementation is really about converting from an idea into an actual product, right? So from an idea of creating a landscape into how do we actually build it, what are the materials, what are the spacing and the sizing of certain things that we need to use. And that's really where the second half comes in. The next is digital landscapes. This is tools and techniques that we are embedding with our students or teaching our students in order for them to generate things that they would otherwise have a lot of problems resolving with just pen and paper, for example, right? And then the last category is ecological studies. Landscape architecture is very heavily entrenched in nature, in natural processes, in understanding the current environmental issues that the world is facing. So that's another big area that we are going to look at. So just a couple of slides for each category, just to let you have a flavor of what exactly landscape architecture is all about. So like I mentioned, the first is community engagement, and it's not just about designing for people, but it's really involving people in the process as well. So to do this, we always go to the site as much as possible, and we, as much as possible, speak to the people that we are designing for. So in this example here, our co-tutor Evie is bringing our students to Queenstown Public Library to understand a little bit more about the history of Queenstown, as well as to speak to people on the ground. We also spend a lot of time, and we encourage our students to spend a lot of time walking the ground itself, to really understand, just the nuances of how people live, how people move around that particular space, what are the intrinsic qualities of that space that can only be kind of extracted by you visiting the site itself. Now, once you have a better indication of the site, then you need to understand what are your stakeholders. So this example, for example, there are people who want to cycle, there are people who want to walk, and then of course there are cars and such. So how do we design the landscapes such that each of these stakeholders, each of these different user groups are accounted for, such that everybody goes off with kind of a win-win situation, right? So how do we split the space? How do we create the various landscape elements that allow for this to happen? A lot of time we use diagramming to understand things. So we diagram such that we can understand where are the hotspots where people are active, what are the modes of transportation, where are the routes of transportation, where is the vegetation linking from one place to another, etc., etc. Diagramming and mapping, this is something that we do very often to digest and communicate some of these findings that we get as we visit the sites. We also rely a lot on visualizations, even in the first year, in the first semester. So this is a mishmash of Photoshop together with hand drawings to understand what the students' desire of the places. In this case, obviously, there is a difference between the cycling lane and the walking lane, but there's some kind of confluence at certain areas of the design. In later years, when you are more adept at Photoshop, you can start doing photo montages. So landscape architects are not shy of structure, right? So in this case, you can see the vegetation material is not placed on the ground. It's actually placed on an elevated bridge. And this bridge not only serves then as an elevated park, but also as a connector between different buildings in the landscape itself. We look a lot at creating more livable places, like I mentioned, for people. So we look at how can we create some of these dead spaces which are currently probably just grass and a couple of trees. How do we embed them with something that makes that particular place more significant to the people that are using it? So this can be the inclusion of play areas, of amphitheaters, of benches and seating, of areas whereby people can use that outdoor space in a communal way, such that they can be kind of invited into this outdoor space and kind of work together as a community, all in the comfort of being under some trees. So another view of that same space that we saw earlier, and in this case you can see it's not true 3D rendered, it is kind of like an artist impression, and this is perfectly fine for landscape architecture in kind of expressing the mood that you want of that space. So in this case, instead of again just an empty field, we have kind of activated the space by bringing in play elements, by bringing in landscape architectural elements to engage people in this outdoor space. Even in dead spaces, like what originally was here was just a slope, we can potentially use landscape architecture and landscape architectural elements to bring more function to that space, to bring more value to that space. So in this case, it could be just a flight of stairs for people watching, but at the same time, it's still very comfortable because it's still kind of hidden under the shade of trees, right? And one very important thing is that we want to bring people closer to nature. And that's one of the biggest roles that landscape architect has to play, especially in urbanizing regions like in Asia, in Singapore, for example. We want to have designs that not only are very functional in nature, but also very beautiful because they engage natural elements with the rest of the design landscape. So in this case, how can we incorporate nature play using a stream or a water element together with the design landscape at the same time? Like I mentioned, it's not just an artistic endeavor. We don't just create nice drawings. We want to show our students that there's a way in which we can convert these drawings and these ideas into reality. Of course, not in an academic setting. It will only happen when you're in practice, but you have to learn how these things are put together. And again, this requires a lot of site visits. Most of these kind of ideas are lost to people who visit parks because they don't appreciate the amount of sensitivity that designers have in order to allow some of this to happen. So things like what materials will you be using, how high should the stepping stones be to make sure that they are not inundated by water, or where is the best location for a bridge in order to have the best connection over a river, right? So all these have to be slowly understood and developed over time. Like I mentioned, plant material is also very important. How do people plant? What are their interests when it comes to community gardens? What the species that they are interested in. A lot of the times it's actually not horticultural species, but actually edible species. So that's another very big concern as well. And even something as simple as what kind of sand are you going to use? Are you going to use rougher gravel, or are you going to use very fine sand? So these students are just simply touching in, and that's again something that a lot of people don't understand, that there is actually a difference in the materiality even in sand, and not just sand, it goes to bark and then grass and then shrubs, etc., etc. There's a difference in the experiential qualities of all of these materials, and you have to touch, feel, step on it in order to appreciate some of these differences. We highly recommend, and in some cases require, our students to work with their hands to create physical models. And the fact of the physical models isn't for you to create the next masterpiece in sculpture, but it's more for you to understand, again, materiality, understand space making, understand scale, and the only way to do this really is to get your hands dirty and start creating some of these physical models themselves. The physical models can also be used in additional studies. So this example here is the student created a physical model, and she's studying how differences in time will affect the shape of this particular structure that she is designing for. Again, how shade from trees kind of changes the space. and how the placement of landscape elements within a site can alter the perception as well as the reception of certain spaces. So over here, for example, in the forefront, you can see that obviously you put a bench under a tree where it's nice and shady, so that you can get the maximum amount of thermal comfort. Like I mentioned, we use a lot of models not only to explain things at the detail level but also at a larger level. One of the things that landscape architects tend to do is to work with topography, which is the terrain, and this is often overlooked as to how important this is. So the term itself, landscape, kind of already connotates that you are supposed to scape the land, you're supposed to adjust the land, right? And we adjust this for various reasons, one of them being to allow for more easy access. For example, the area here, for example, where it's more gently sloping will be a much easier access in some of these higher sloped areas. But we also adjust topography to move water around, right? So water always flows downhill. That's a universal fact. But at what speed is it going at? Can you direct it to somewhere that you want and kind of push it away from somewhere that you don't want, right? So can you control water, especially in the tropics where where we have monsoon rains, using changes in the topography, and that's something that's very critical in our teaching as well. Like I mentioned, it's about how do we convert from an idea into reality, and part and parcel of that is really understanding construction means. So although we talk about soil and such, we are not shy with concrete, we're not shy with glass, etc. It's just a matter of, is this the appropriate material, and at what size and what scale, and how are you going to put this together in order for you to create the landscape that you're designing from. So over here, for example, there's not even a single vegetation material, but this is still considered landscape architecture because of the kind of overarching context that it's in. It's actually a play garden, a playscape. Here combining the digital landscape architecture with detailed design as well, looking at how landscapes are put together, not just in the two-dimensional version that you see here, but also in 3 dimensions. So again, color, scale, size, materials, even subterranean, the detailing, all these are important things for us to understand when we are going from just designing on paper or physical model into actually having a project that is potentially buildable. At a larger scale, we also look at how can we ensure that in the process of urbanization and kind of building taller buildings, can we ensure that there's an equal amount of vegetation that goes back into buildings, right? One of the things that we use in Singapore is calculating GNPR, or green plot ratio. To put it simply, it's just a measure of how much vegetation material there is in a particular site. So on the right of the image, you can see the original green plot ratio was 2.1, and then after landscape architects go in and try to maximize every potential place that you can add greening, it can be pushed up for 4.3. So of course, this is on the assumption that the more green you have, the better. So like I mentioned, we explore a lot of digital tools and techniques. We try to expose our students to that. And there are 2 main kinds of tools and techniques that we look at. The first, like I mentioned in another video, is mapping. Mapping is extremely crucial, a method that we have as landscape architects. We use mapping to understand distances, to understand connections, to understand relationships across different kinds of elements in the landscape, right? Which are not easily visible from the ground level. So if you go to a site and see it from a human perspective, you might miss certain larger picture things that can only be expressed and understood from that top-down view. So the images on the right, for example, are very typical of landscape architectural site analysis. We take the contours, which is the topography. We look at the hydrology, which is where water flows. We look at the vegetation layer, vehicular circulation layer, human circulation area, and then of course the building layer. And we stack all these on top of each other to have a little bit of a better understanding of how a landscape actually is. And then of course, after we understand it, only then can we then start designing for it. Another aspect that we're looking at more recently is the introduction of various forms of digital techniques. So over here is the introduction of VR and AR technology. So what we have is a digital model to replace a physical one, in which this digital model is projected into an AR augmented reality environment, and then students can use the tablet and move around it to understand the space a little bit better. We also ask students to look at why can't you use digital models to indicate your ideas, right? So digital models can also be used on top of physical models to create not just the final representation, but also the intermediate ones where we are kind of explaining the idea that you have in the design of your final product. We welcome innovative students to explore certain controversial means of representing their design landscapes. So one student, for example, last semester, in her final presentation, showed us a Roblox model. I have no idea what Roblox is until she showed it to us. And she had students in the class kind of running around her design landscape based on this Roblox model as well. So this is again slightly controversial, but again, you know, we are open to such ideas from the students. A much more down-to-earth practical way is really, again, looking at topography and adjusting it to curate certain experiences. So if you don't know what this pink line is, it's basically a cut through the landscape. It's a section. And in this case, it's a three-dimensional section showing you the various hills and valleys that the student is creating in order for her to curate an experience as she walks from the downhill to the uphill side of her particular project. We looked at parametric modeling. If you don't know what that means, it's basically modeling with scripting, right? So three-dimensional modeling with scripting, and that allows us to create very fancy looking forms. The fancy looking forms again are controversial, but the idea here is that you are able to do it. You understand that there are tools available for you to do it, and thus if you do want to use them, they are available for you as you go out into practice. So these are some examples of outputs from the design studio that specifically looks at digital landscapes. So you can see on the right, for example, a very typical way of layering information through maps. In this case, it's not actually two-dimensional maps, it's three-dimensional maps. On the middle bottom, you can see the Roblox model that I mentioned earlier and the kind of the sections that you saw. And then on the left at the bottom, you can see hyper-realistic rendering. So it's not just about creating hyper-realistic renderings, it's about using the correct communication tool, whether it's realistic or non-realistic, in order to push your idea forward, right? Another example here, you can see on the left, again, mapping at the top, and then these kind of diagrammatic three-dimensional models that explain to us your thought processes, extremely detailed sectional models in the middle, extremely detailed realistic three-dimensional walkthroughs. So this is not just a static thing, you can actually walk through it on the top, middle, or even just Photoshop snapshots of design landscapes, right? Again, it's open to interpretation. It's just a matter of selecting the correct look and feel and medium of that final representation that you want. So the last area that I will explain about is ecological studies. And really it's about not just designing with natural processes, but also learning from them. So how do we learn from the processes of flooding and erosion and plant growth, etc. This is something that again we want to inculcate in our students, because landscape architecture is not static in nature. You don't just create an object and then it stays the same for the rest of time, right? It evolves over time because plant matter change and because you're exposed to the elements, weathering happens, algae grows, etc., etc. So the time element is very important in landscape architecture. Like I mentioned, we don't require you to be excellent in drawing skills. The drawing itself is not the goal. The understanding of what you are drawing is. So in these two slides, for example, you can see the drawing is done pretty well. In general, the student had never touched a pencil and a paper since she was in secondary or primary school. But nonetheless, she used drawing as a medium to understand plant structures, for example. And in the understanding of these plant structures, that then converted into some kind of a design idea that you see on the left of her slide. We also want students to understand that there is not just one kind of color for green. There are like 50 shades of green. Vegetation does not happen just in one horizontal layer. There are actually many, many layers, especially in the tropics. You have your understory layer, your shrub layer, canopy layer, emergent layer, etc. Each of these have a different role to play. Each of these will attract a slightly different kind of biodiversity, different plants, different birds and bees into this particular area. On top of just what is above, there's also a whole world underground that we typically do not see, do not appreciate, and do not understand. But if you are a farmer, you will know that the number one criteria for knowing what to actually plant is the kind of soil that you have. So you have clay soils, it will kind of inform you that only certain kinds of vegetables will be able to be planted here. Or if you have very dry, sandy soils, again, something else will be planted there. So it's not just about what happens above ground, but also what happens below ground. And like I mentioned, it's not just static in time. There are a lot of instances whereby we encourage students to think on a much longer scale. At scale, sometimes kind of extending beyond our human lifespan itself. So in year one, this student, for example, looked at erosion as a potential driver for her design. She looked at how we can not only understand erosion as a process, but use design to encourage and discourage erosion from happening at selected areas in order to achieve her final goal. In Singapore, especially, like I mentioned, we have to interplay built structure with vegetation. More and more recently, you will see that a lot of the landscaping is not happening on the ground, it's actually happening on a built structure, right? So if you look at it, it's actually all unnatural ground, it's all entirely artificial, but yet we are kind of including vegetation material into that. And the goal here is not so much to just green for the sake of greening, but is to allow both humans and nature to exist in the same space. So on the image on the right, for example, humans can still use the pavements, the cars can still use the roads, but there's an emergent layer, a tree canopy layer, in which different kinds of flora and fauna can start to traverse over, where humans will never go. So humans will never climb the trees, but the squirrels, the monkeys, the birds, etc., they will use this emergent layer as a kind of an ecological bridge to get from one part of the landscape to another. Speaking of the birds and bees, every single one of them has a preference. So it depends on what exactly are you trying to attract. Different butterflies, for example, require very different species. They are very species specific. Different kinds of birds as well require different trees to nest in or to forage with. And all of these you kind of need to understand if you want to bring more biodiversity into your urban environment. This is an example. If you don't look at the kind of the bubble diagrams at the top, it looks like any other park. But what the student did here was they selected specific species for specific reasons, right? So they either attract bees, they attract bats, they attract pollinators, they attract butterflies, they are nice smelling, they provide a lot of shade. So it goes much, much deeper than just providing nice looking trees, right? The selection of species itself is something that is very crucial in enabling some of these natural processes to be happening, even though it's a completely artificially planted location. And then the last slide I have is basically this. We are looking at food security as one of Singapore's next goal for 2030. And why can't we look at parks and gardens which are actually also edible, right? Why can't we have vegetables growing and then seasonally we will cultivate them, we will harvest them, and then the next batch comes in, and that too can be a very pleasant experience, not only to be in, but maybe to participate in, right? So one of the things that NParks is pushing again for is for every household to participate in some kind of greening effort, even at the smallest of scale, by just growing some vegetables in their home. So if you want to find out more about landscape architecture, I hope I have made it interesting enough for you to find out more. And if you are visiting this page before the 4th of March 2022, please join us on the 4th of March, this coming Friday. We will be broadcasting in Open Studio live on Instagram. It will happen from 9:30 to 11. So design studios are like the bread and butter of any design course that you will find internationally, not just in NUS. It requires you to, like I mentioned, understand a lot of this background knowledge on ecology, of construction, of digital methods, in order for you to create something within the design project itself. So join us for behind the scenes look. It will be a year 3 design studio, so a little bit more on the advanced side, but the fundamentals are still the same. If again you are joining us before the 4th or 5th of March, on the 5th of March we will have a physical open house in which you can come and experience CDE for yourselves. You can come and look at the exhibits that we have. We have a few more videos that are available, and of course you can come and speak to not just us, the faculty members, but to students as well who are on site to answer any of the student related questions that you have. The only catch is that you need to sign up for these because of current COVID related measures. So please go into the website, QR code on the right, and then sign up for one of the sessions. From the time of recording, the afternoon sessions are still quite free, so please go ahead and sign up for one of those. Lastly, I invite you to join us on Facebook, on Instagram, or just go to our website to understand a little bit more about what we do, to look at the past works that students have presented, or even just to check out faculty members like myself or any of our other faculty members to see whether or not this is something that you are interested in. So feel free to reach out to us. It can be mundane questions, it can be sensitive questions, it doesn't matter. If it makes you have a better idea of what we do and helps you decide to join us in our BLA family, we are more than happy to answer you. Okay, with that, I thank you for your time, and I hope to see you in CDE at NUS, and of course specifically at the BLA program.